The Devin Townsend podcast once again is presented by InsideOutMusic. And this month's featured release is by a band called Whom Gods Destroy. And their album's called Insanium. Listen to this, all heavy and progressive and grammatically correct. Whom Gods Destroy? Insanium.
Another one in the continuing process of learning how to communicate with other human beings in a musical format. Devin Townsend podcast. What episode is this? One of them. This month I am very proud to have been able to interview someone who I can now call a friend, which is fantastic because he's 1 in 8 billion, I guess, as we all are, but the one that he is significantly more interesting to me than most. Mike Keneally. Mike is, if you go to his Wikipedia page, you will see all the things that he's been involved with, which is too much to list here. But this is how I would describe Mike. I've met a lot of people in my life, or at least a handful of people in my life, that I think are just shockingly brilliant, but most of them are dicks. I don't know what it is. It's like they use their intelligence to make other people feel bad or worse than them, or just condescending in some sense. But Mike is like this super genius that uses his powers for good. He's just such an incredible musician in so many, he's Mike Keneally. So here, it's Mike Keneally. Cheers. Can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh man, we've passed the first 2 tests. That's great.
These are the easiest of the tests.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How you doing?
Peachy.
Yeah,
How
nice. I'm good too. I feel like I'm frustrated just because everything's almost set up, but it's not quite. So there's just, you get into this like flow where you're able to start to write or just relax or get into your own thoughts, but then there's always things to deal with. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's like,
yeah, of course,
someone ringing or someone coming to the door, and it's just, I think it's a real specific type of frustration too, where you're just like, I give up.
Oh no! Oh, that's your response
After 3 of them.
After 3 interruptions or barriers. That's okay.
I think the frustration also includes the fact that it's technically been functional since the beginning.
Okay,
so
right.
It's been able to proceed with some degree of efficiency, but just the amount less that makes it satisfying. But we're almost there, man. We're almost there. Yeah.
You'll get it.
Well, thanks for doing this, brother.
Yeah, of course.
I'd love to start by sort of giving the mission statement for this, which essentially is, in the process of trying to figure out where I've landed and where I'm at creatively for the next bout of material. I've been using this podcast with brilliant people such as yourself to shed light on it, not only for my own edification, but for everybody else that is watching this as well, because I think the stumbling blocks are pretty much across the board. I think everybody has similar issues.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody I've had a chance to interview has had a real specific skill set, and having had the privilege of working with you for the past few years, your improvisational skills are something that I can't wrap my head around, and I'd love to pick your brain on that to start with.
Okay, that could be instructive for me also, because that's not a thing I ever really analyze. So maybe you'll pull something out that will surprise me as well.
Or by the end of it, we just won't be able to do it anymore.
Exactly. Oh no, we've thought about it too much.
Yeah, well, I think that's, maybe that's the answer I might be looking for.
Mm.
So the first question is just to set up this conversation. What was your first memory of falling in love with music?
That's interesting. The first thing that comes to mind is the Beatles, because I was born at just the right time for that to hit me hard when I was very very young. But I also know that there was some pre-Beatles, like kids TV music that got me real big. But I would have to say the first stuff that I got really sort of obsessive about to a degree that was annoying and a distraction to the people around me was the Beatles, and that came from having a teenage sister in the mid and late 60s who was very strongly affected by Beatlemania and collected a bunch of the records. But then at the point that the Beatles got weird or too weird for her, she gave up on them, and I inherited all of her Beatles records and memorabilia, and I fell in love to a degree that was life changing. So I'd have to point at that, and it's definitely like a love that's endured to the present moment.
Do you remember the moment and the song?
Well, I think that I remember, like a lot of people, hearing "I Want to Hold Your Hand" on the radio, which in the United States that was sort of like the flashpoint. That was the moment of magic that for a lot of people. And I just remember it having a sound and a texture and a feeling that was unlike anything else I'd experienced. And it's also interesting because all of their records were remastered and sometimes remixed for American release as compared to the original UK releases. And there's actually something about the American mastering of these things that's just like it's in some ways maybe more two-dimensional, but because of that, it hits you even more squarely in the center of your head and your sensibilities. It really was like an explosion from another galaxy or something. So I would have to point at that particular song, and I was probably 5 or 6 when I heard it for the first time, and realized that something had changed in me and in the world.
Could you define in hindsight what it was about that piece of music? Like what was the component to it that made it so different from what you had heard prior?
It's anytime you gather a group of musicians and they decide, okay, we are now a group. That group is the sum total of what those four music the sound that those four musicians produce, or as Brian Beller puts it, each musician's note. Every musician has their note, which is sort of a microcosmic way of describing just the sound, the texture of the sound, the shape, the content of the sound that any musician produces. So it just so happened that the sound of both their instruments in combination and also their voices in combination, and then you take those two elements, their instruments, the specific type of guitars, the amps they were playing through, the way Ringo hit a drum, that that made an instrumental sound when you combine those four things. Then on top of that, you layer the way their voices sounded together, um, and it produced something that I'm a fan, so I would describe it as magical. But it's almost like the luck of the draw that it just so happened that when you combine those four people and the sounds they produced, the sum total of it was this sound, and it's a texture and it's vibrations, and I think a lot of it had to do with the way John Lennon and Paul McCartney's voices filled in one another's gaps. John Lennon's voice is more razor sharp. Paul McCartney's voice is more round and velvety, and those things together formed a complete picture when you combined them. And then the same with John Lennon's rhythm guitar sound and George Harrison's guitar fills, and Paul McCartney's picked Hofner bass sound combined with Ringo's Ludwig drums. Just all these things together made that sound, and nothing else ever made that sound, and still hasn't. Even though a lot of bands have been influenced by the Beatles and have attempted to pay homage to that and do things that you could describe as Beatlesque, but most bands, when they do something Beatlesque, it tends to boil down to like two or three sort of cliched elements that people have decided these are the things that sound like the Beatles. But the thing is, it was just the Beatles that sounded like the Beatles, and any song that they played, no matter what the musical content was, sounded like those guys. It's the best way I can think to describe it.
Do you know anything about what their relationship was like in the beginning?
Very close, because they had that, a hard Scrabble existence, 3 years together before they had any kind of or more, before they had any kind of commercial success, and they went to Germany to get gigs, and they were like practically playing in brothels, and having to play 9 hours a night, and they were like uh taking drugs to stay awake, and they were developing stagecraft, the crazy things to do on stage to keep the audience's attention and to gain their favor. And and they were like really almost like a punk band at that point. They were wearing leather, and they were rough, and living in squalor. Nothing like what came later, when everything got cleaned up and they put on suits and ties, and became everybody's darlings. So they went through a lot of really rough times together, so that by the time they met a guy who wanted to manage them, who had industry contacts, who made the right phone calls, and found the right record label and all this stuff. Uh, they had gone through all of this together, and they were like ready to strike and make an impact.
So it's almost because of that adversity in the beginning, they were able to formulate the ability to communicate with each other.
They became a band during those years, and they always said later that they were at their peak as a live band in those pre-fame years. Like, if they what John Lennon said is that the sound that they generated as a struggling band was incredibly powerful, compared to later on, when they couldn't even hear themselves on stage because of all the screaming. And technologically, that's always really astonishing to watch videos of them in the 1964 and 1965, essentially performing to a tsunami of screaming young girls, and that's an outrageous sound in and of itself. And they had no, back then, what they called fold back monitors. They didn't have any wedges. They couldn't hear themselves. They were literally just like, from rote, performing these songs, and it's still incredibly powerful and tight and together. Some gigs more than others, but like, there's a performance of them in 1964, right, the first time they came to the U.S. in Washington, D.C., and energy-wise, it's like watching Nirvana or something. They're so raging, and it sounds incredible, and there's no monitors on stage, so it's like a miracle.
Did improvisation play into their work in the beginning?
I imagine it did, in the pre-fame days, when they were playing in clubs in Hamburg, and they literally had to like do 6 sets a night, and do something to keep themselves and the audience engaged. But once they got to the point where they were going on stage, within their fame, um, the shows were very short. Back then, a concert could be 20 minutes long. It was like a lightning strike. And in every aspect of it was highly choreographed. So, even the guitar solos were pretty much note for note what was on the record at that point. There was occasionally you would see something break out, like there's footage of them at Shea Stadium in 1965, and they're playing a song called "I'm Down," and John Lennon is playing organ, and it was the largest audience they'd ever played to, so the sound of the screaming was exponentially larger than it had ever been. and John Lennon just kind of breaks and starts playing the organ with his elbows and just going nuts. Um, but apparently, even that had to be overdubbed in the studio later because the organ wasn't recorded properly. So him going into this insane Sun Ra organ playing, even that is like a technological uh, uh, smoke and mirrors situation because what you hear is not exactly what he played in the moment. But still, there's no way to like play a scored organ part with your elbow. So so that was by necessity improvised.
In a sense, it's intriguing that improvisation is so often attributed to technique on the instrument or as a painter or as a filmmaker. But with that example, it's nice to extend the definition of improvisation to something like that. So the definition
Yeah,
of it is less about, okay, well, the proficiency in the instrument on the instrument allows you to manifest your moment. Rather, it's okay, well, how do you react to that moment,
exactly.
instrumentationally aside?
Yeah,
So
that was a reflection of a genuine feeling that he had in this moment, which is this is insane. I can't hear myself. We're playing into a void, but we might as well enjoy ourselves while we're doing it. It's fun because he's got a huge smile on his face while he's doing it. George Harrison is standing next to him, cracking up while he's doing it. You know, it was a good release of tension, but it is also a sound, just like all music and music is sound. Music isn't technique, and so it's like it's what that is. What improvisation is often just what sound can I produce in order to maximize this moment to make the most of what's happening on stage right now, what the other musicians are playing. Uh, what can I contribute to this? And that can be one note. It doesn't have to be anything that's technique oriented. It's just about I can feel a void in the universe right now that could only be filled by this sound that I'm imagining, that I'm receiving, and what can I do to execute that note, that sound, you know?
I have two questions based on that. One, um, the precursor to being able to articulate those moments requires at least a modicum of technique. And so the first question is, how invested in technique were you prior to when you started working professionally? And second question would be, how do you listen to, well, let's get to that second one in a moment. So technique.
Yeah, I was always fascinated by it, but I only had like a minimum of musical training. I never had guitar lessons. I had organ lessons as a young guy, you know, from like 9 to 14. Um, but at a certain point, I became fascinated because my first instrument was organ. I heard Emerson, Lake and Palmer when I was 9 years old, and the technique that was required to execute particularly this piece called Tarkus was really fascinating to me. And I wanted to because I didn't know that you were even allowed to play the organ like that. You know, it sounded so nasty because he had this, you know, kind of overdriven percussive Hammond sound. And then the stuff that he was writing and playing was so compositionally uh, uh, intense that I was like I wanted to decode it. I wanted to figure out how to do it myself. So even from a very early age, I was like trying to push my technique and learn how to do certain things. And then, you know, that led me to a bunch of other progressive rock that was very, you know, ostentatiously technique oriented. And in order to learn how to play these things off the records, which was what I was doing, was like, you know, getting these records and teaching myself how to play the parts. And then as obviously, especially once I got into Zappa and his music was so phenomenally difficult to execute that it was very important to me, the technique thing, you know, in a way that it's fascinating to a lot of young players and teenagers when they're starting. They're impressed by things that are hard to play and they want to figure out how to do that. So it takes a certain amount of seasoning and time to realize that, yeah, but that's not really music. You need to move past the stage of just wanting to impress people and And nowadays we're at a point where the talent pool of players is so wide, and there are so many players out there that can execute unbelievable things on their instruments. It's, in a way that would have been unfathomable 50 years ago. Uh, so that's why at a certain point you reach the stage of, okay, well, so now I have this toolbox of things that I can do. How can I use these tools to create something that expresses something unique to myself that other people might get some use out of.
Did you find with the work that you had put into learning how to be proficient at your instrument and learning the technical aspects of figuring out these complex compositions, did that integrate into your musical spirit? Uh, did it is the fabric of your being colored by that experience sort of from then on, or is it something that you have to maintain on a theoretical level?
It doesn't require maintenance. If anything, it requires purging, because the stuff that I hear in my head when I'm in composition or recording mode tends to be a lot of crazy intricate stuff, and I think sometimes it can be too much, and maybe it's interesting, the thing of expressing yourself. Some of it is, you can be hiding from yourself maybe in the act of attempting to express yourself because of habits that you've fallen into, or patterns. Um, and the main thing for me whenever I'm recording or writing something is I want to try and just make something I've never heard before, and that could mean anything. And it doesn't mean necessarily just like something I've never done before. It means literally something I've never heard anyone do. I'm looking for combinations of sounds that that I just haven't experienced before. Um, and and that there's always a variety of techniques that you might try in attempting to find that. Sometimes I'll improvise onto a recording because improvisation feels like a more direct conduit to parts of myself than taking the time to compose something. And then I'll decorate that improvisation with harmonized overdubs, and reharmonizing with different chords to recontextualize the initial improvisation. But I've done this a bunch. So at this point, I'm thinking, is this something I need to keep doing, or is it time to, like, it feels like a good time. Because as you know, when we were on the road last year, I was spending all that time in the back of the bus, working on music, and with the headphones on, just like headbanging back there, making all of this weird music. And a lot of that stuff is decorated improvisation, and I love the way it sounds, and it would be very exciting to me. Um, but it also kind of feels like maybe that's a good time to say, all right, that's that approach, and then and when I move into the next stage of creating new music, or creating is a fraught word, being a part of the creation of new music, um, an agent of creation. Uh, I'd like to explore new ways that I think are going to be more compositional, less improvisational, just because I feel like I've done that a lot. Even though there's still no substitute for true unfettered improvisation, but part of me thinks that's more suited for the stage. Like next week, I'm going to be going to the Baked Potato for a couple of nights with my band Beer for Dolphins, and I'm going to be playing a lot of guitar solos, and I'm really excited about it because it's been a while since I've done just like those type of explorations on stage. It's been almost a year since I played my own music on stage, and I'm feeling very ready.
Mike Keneally, the agent of creation. So, who was the first improviser that caught your ear after you're thinking Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Beatles? There's got to be one person you're like, what the fuck is he doing? And how is that happening?
It's interesting. Yeah, it's the how is it happening thing because when I was very young and listening to records, I wasn't yet making the distinction between the composed parts of a song and the improvised parts of the song. It was all just music. Um, and the really great improvisers to me were ones who were making solos that sounded as just as much a crucial part of the composition as anything that had been, you know, composed with forethought. But I wouldn't have known the answer to that question. But the first, like at first I thought, was it Zappa? And I don't think it was because the aspects of Frank that initially got to me weren't the guitar soloing, because he didn't even really completely find himself as a soloist until around 1973, and I had already been listening to him for 3 years at that point. Actually, when I think about it, there's a Dutch player named Jan Akkerman who is the guitarist or was the guitarist for a band called Focus that I was really really into. And it's possible that you could say, well, Jimi Hendrix had already made an impression on me at that point. And Jeff Beck had I wouldn't even say that Beck made a strong impression until Blow by Blow in '75. So I think it might very well be Jan Ackerman, particularly his playing on an album called Focus 3 that I heard when I was 10 years old. And there are long guitar solos on there, and he's conveying so much attitude through his technique. He's sputtering out these incredible strings of notes, and doing articulations and sweeping and things that no other guitar player was doing in the same way he was. And it was all a result of his attitude and his personality coming through the guitar. And I this was confirmed for me years later when I met him and did an improvised night of music with him, and hung out with him and ate with him and got to know him and realized that he's like this very constantly amused, kind of smart ass, funny, suffers no fools kind of guy. Sort of reminds me of Scott Tunis in a way, the Dutch guitar playing Scott Tunis. And Scott Tunis is an excellent guitar player, by the way. That's a diversion. But he conveyed something on those records that introduced me to a style of guitar playing that I had never heard before. I couldn't even say that Keith Emerson had made the same kind of impression on me as an improviser prior to that, because many of Keith's solos were composed. So Keith's impact on me was as a composer and as a player, and Ackerman's impact on me was definitely as an improviser and a commentator, because a lot of the songs for that band were composed by the keyboardist, Thijs van Leer, and then Ackerman would play his guitar over Van Leer's compositions, which are very Bach influenced and very stately and very lovely. And if you just played them as he composed them, they would just sound like a recital. But then Ackerman would just like spit all over them with this really kind of insolent, crazy guitar playing and his phrases. And so he was like making an impression on me personally through his playing, and he might have been the first improviser to do that.
Here's a difficult question. I just would be interested in your thoughts on it. It seems like a lot of the improvisers that we've talked about thus far are very confident personalities. They've got a very strong sense of self.
Yeah.
So in order to extrapolate somebody's personality and imbue that into an improvisational moment, is there any suggestions you could give to people to get out of their own way if their self-awareness is constantly rooted in criticism?
Mm. Yeah, well, you alluded to that earlier when you said, we were talking about something and you said, well, you need to have like a sort of a base level of technique in order to accomplish this. That what you just described is, I think, can only be a function of time, but also patience. Um, because the only it's really rare. Some personalities do, I think, emerge from the womb ready to do that, and just pick up a guitar, and all of a sudden you're like, Elvis Presley, in terms of just like having zero insecurity, apparently, and just being extremely confident. Um, but you do have to make sure that you have your chops together to a certain degree to in order to sort of imagine the type of musical statement that you want to make, and then have that statement just come out. So, because you could exude tremendous self-confidence, and but then not back it up musically, which people see through that, and ultimately won't do you very good. So I think you have to. I think humility, even while being super confident, is very important. You do have to, to a certain degree, feel like uh, that you are extremely capable, and that's wonderful. But I also think that there are many factors at play that made you that way, that don't all stem from yourself. So you can't take full credit for whatever kind of player you are. Um, and so you just need to put the time in, and play for probably years and years, unless you've been blessed with the type of personality that is just extremely confident, and then you could back that up with the whatever technique is required. It's not easy, and for most people it's not something that you can start searching for from day one. You need to lay the groundwork as a player before you can start to get out of your own way, which is the single key thing. Because where there are mistakes of execution, or maybe long strings of uninspired playing, it's usually because you have stopped yourself from tapping into the magic that music can offer. Because I do feel like that music is always ready to be served and to serve you, no matter what the circumstances of a gig might be. Maybe the monitors do suck. Maybe the audience is a bunch of assholes. Maybe you are really mad at the bass player, for or whatever's going on. There's still a way to tap into what music has to offer and what you can do to serve it. Um, and and yeah, a certain amount of self-confidence is real crucial in those moments, because the moment you really start to doubt yourself, that's when you trip over yourself. That's when you start thinking that you have to impress people, and then your fingers trip over themselves, and you kind of forget about what is really going on here, which is there's an opportunity to create a musical moment that will never be repeated. And that musical moment could be very important to the people in the audience. You could be creating a memory in that moment that will stay with these people for a lifetime, even if it's just one night out of 40 on a tour that you're doing. It's only one night for those people in the audience, and that'll never happen again. So it is sort of an important responsibility to be there for that.
When we look at the problem of getting out of your own way based on insecurity or self-deprecating ways, that's one thing. But what if the problem is, as an agent of creation, or as someone who's participating in that flow of musical ideas, the fascination of listening to it in the moment is what trips you up?
Ah, I really try to, like, when I'm playing with you on stage, and we've got our in-ears dialed in, and I've got your guitar on the left and my guitar on the right, so that it's much easier to lock, and I'm hearing what everybody else is doing, and all the sounds that are flying around. I'm I'm sort of being a producer as much as a player, in those moments. And and a like a record producer whose job it is to hear a song and figure out what does that song need to flourish. So that's what I'm when I hear this stuff, really nicely situated in my head, and I'm a part of it. That's when very subtle variations in tech in articulation can have a big impact in how well that song is coming across. Like I'll find, because I hear myself so well in my ears, that if I move my pick just a little bit on the string, it'll change the texture of the sound so much that to me, all of a sudden, things just feel so much tighter and so much texturally cooler. And when I'm really locked into that, I think, even though it's nothing that anybody in the audience could identify, oh, the second guitar player just moved his pick a little bit. It helps the sound of the music come across in a way that is effective. And I have I it's not a scientific study, but I did notice that on nights where I seemed particularly locked into that reality, that there seemed to be a more of an acknowledgement after the show, or I would see things online that people would it just seemed like that there was something that happened that night. And I'm not saying that I was responsible for it. And I have a feeling, because the other guys in the band would also say, wow, something just really happened there. And I think that there are some nights where everybody's just more locked into that, more into the simultaneous creation, where we're not just four people on a stage. We together we comprise this organism. And some nights that those four components really lock in a special way, and the audience can feel that.
Kinetic,
I
I
think.
guess, in a sense.
Sure.
Yeah. I, I,
Uh-huh.
it made me wonder, there must have been a point in your career where you had a lesson in what it means to truly listen, because I think there's a lesson that would involve that technique that a lot of people just don't have the opportunity to learn. Either it wasn't thrust upon them, or they were managing to structure their career so that they never had to participate in being told anything. But was there a moment in your career where you remember, oh, this serves me well to shut up right now, or this serves me well to let this play out, so then I can have an informed decision that I contribute to this?
I think, and it's funny, because I resisted in-ears for a really long time, because I thought that it was going to shut me off from the energy in the room. But 5 years ago is when I had no choice but to start using in-ears, because I was on a tour that had stuff that involved clicks and pre-recorded tracks and stuff. And so obviously you can't have that stuff. You can't have a click playing through your wedge, because the audience will hear it. So in-ears became a necessity. And I realized that I was being, like, the whole time I was in Death Clock, the guys at front of house were trying to get me to move to in-ears, and I just wouldn't do it. But then once I started doing it, and then obviously once I started playing with you, and it became a necessity to use them, I feel like in some ways I realized how much I wasn't hearing prior to that, because now I could really hear everything that was happening on stage. So that was a big step forward. But I think I was already I was already more keyed into the sometime probably. I would probably say sometime in the late 2000s, from playing more with my band. I started to consciously become aware of myself as a cog, rather than as the guy. Like, there are performances that I did in the 90s, where I was like so suffused with energy and passion, and feeling sort of like touched by the divine that I would get so into my own trip that I thought it was, positively impacting the performance emotionally. But then, years later, I would see some of these performances and be fairly horrified by how I was like running roughshod over the music rather than helping it to be all it could be. And because I wasn't calm at all. I was like too enervated. I was too filled with some kind of spirit that I thought was a divine spirit, but might have been just the opposite because it wasn't helping matters. Uh, at least from my current perspective, I don't think it made the music better. It was especially negatively impacting my vocal performances, which I think did me some harm because it I people don't tend to think of me as a vocalist, and I think it's because I did spend a number of years just going out there, not focusing enough on it. Uh, Feeling like as long as I'm playing guitar okay, I can just do whatever vocally and it'll be fine. But I wasn't serving the songs properly that way. So now I take that a lot more seriously. But I think I realized at a certain point, man, listen to what the rest of the band are playing. It's so good. If I really can, calm down. I really can play less. And I can find that kernel of calmness within myself, and I can still play crazy stuff. But the more calm that I am internally, the more effective the crazy stuff is. And I've really learned, like gone a step further from playing with you, uh, particularly in the importance of laying back, how powerful things sound when you're not constantly on top of the beat, and rushing forward, which is real easy to do when you're feeling passionate and feeling like you're in the throes of some kind of discovery, which is when you deal with music improvisationally, as I frequently do with my own music. On stage, I always view my own songs as a blueprint, as opposed to something to be executed precisely the same way every time. It excites me to use a song as a springboard for something different every time I play it. But within that, there's this I have to constantly be aware of the fact that the excitement in that can lead you to rush, and that doesn't help the song come off. It's when you lay back, and we really felt this last year with James and Darby, that when the four of us simultaneously did this thing where we just like pulled back, it just made it sound gargantuan. It was really a nice thing.
Next question, and I'm just gonna say it, and then just whatever comes to mind. Frank Zappa.
Yeah. He had such an impact on my life, even before I ever met him or played with him. And I was fascinated by his humor. I was fascinated by his attitude, his bloody mindedness, his individualism and individuality. The fact that there was nothing else like him. I loved the fact that he seemed to be unimpressed by everything. And that manifested in a lyrical attitude that was frequently very funny and for me very entertaining. And I also really was delighted by the conceptual aspects of his work, whereby he tied everything together. Uh, like he said, it's somebody asked him in an interview once about how what he thought of his body of work, and he said it's all one album. He could take a razor blade and cut it up and rechange the order of everything, and it would still result in a series of coherent pieces of work. And he tied things together conceptually from album to album with little snatches of music or little snatches of lyric or lyrical concepts that would be repeated from album to album. And you could plot, what he called conceptual continuity over the course of years. And that was sort of like being a part of a secret club where you would find these little references and be able to piece all of these works together. And that was fascinating to me. And I loved the sound of his music, and I loved trying to figure it out and trying to learn how to play it. But then as time goes on, I realized there were aspects of it that had such a strong hold on me. There was a certain negativity to a lot of it, and there was a certain cynicism to and he was proudly cynical. He thought that it was insane to not be cynical, and and especially after I continued working through the first half of the '90s when I was in Dweezil's band, and Frank did an album called Them or Us, and that was sort of like an us against the world mindset that was really had a stronghold in that band as we traveled across the world. And it really did kind of feel like we were, we wanted to entertain audiences, but it also kind of felt like we were it was almost like an ongoing argument with the world. And I think that the older I get, the less useful that has become for me. Even though there's all sorts of reasons to be cynical. It didn't feel like there was a useful energy for me to be propagating anymore. I didn't feel that I needed to be a part of that energy. Whereas in the '90s, I really loved the anti-entertainment aspect of that. Like I was always a big Andy Kaufman fan. I loved the thing of just challenging an audience to a point where there was in the Dweezil band, we had this medley of songs from the '70s, 200 songs from the '70s that would have little moments of improvisation, so that at its shortest it was about a half hour long. At its longest it could be like 45 minutes or more, and you could see the audience being with it for a while, and then at a certain point you could see them drifting away, and then you could see them locking back in, and then you could see them like approach this state of like satori, where simultaneously everybody would kind of levitate. It was to me a really valuable artistic thing where we really pushed the limits of what you could get away with on stage. But then at other times it just felt like a bunch of private jokes. And I think that there's a kind of immaturity to that where you're not allowing your audience to be a part of it with you. It's sort of like we're in this club and you're not, and I don't think that's very cool, especially when somebody's paid for a ticket. So I think I'm much more into the idea in maybe a kind of a hippie-ish way of the fact that the audience is really still is just as just as important a part of the performance as the people on stage, and it's we're all trying to create something together here, and it's an energy and it's an experience, and it only happens this one time.
I'm going to give you one more question that I would like to propose from the point of view of maybe somebody who is 18-year-old guitar player, keyboard player, somebody who's just getting into it, has the baseline of technique. They've kind of established the proficiency to be able to articulate things that they're looking to represent sonically or modally. And I guess there's the freedom to foster the type of freedom that would almost most poignantly come into play when you're losing an audience, like you just said. So say you're in the middle of something and you recognize the audience is going away, but you also know there's another 15 minutes of this. You've decided as a band that this track is where you're at, and you're looking out and you're like, oh my God, I'm losing them. My typical reaction to that uh, is to be really aware of it and insecure about it. So if I start to lose them, I lose sight of the intent of the music that I'm trying to perform, and I
Mhm.
become predisposed with the awareness of, oh, where are they going? Oh my God, this is me. Oh, and all the insecurity starts coming back. I never got the impression that that's you. And not that you don't care, but you just seem to be focused on the music. And how the heck do you do that?
Um, I'm very much focused on the music, and I'd like to think that I'm not immune to what's going on in the audience, although I know that there are times where it's impossible to be everywhere at once. And we're all humans. We're all really freaking flawed. So we're not always, like super tapped into everything that's happening in the room. But I do think my best chance of serving the audience properly is is to serve the music. That's what the audience is going to respond to. They're not going to respond to me pandering to them. They're going to respond to me executing and serving the music as best I can. So if I'm in the middle of a lengthy piece, and I think that the audience is somewhere else, um, I'm probably in the moment I'm going to think, okay, this is as a result of some faulty execution on my part. It might even be that I was wrong about that night's set list, because pretty much every performance I do is a different set list, and that there's a real risk to that because it doesn't give you the opportunity to fine tune a series of songs. Well, the problem is when I'm going out and playing my own music, the budget isn't there to do a long tour and to fine tune a set over the period of time. So it's all experimentation. Some nights you might not get it right in terms of the flow of music from one song to the next. So if I'm in the middle of a song and I feel like I've lost the audience, there's two things that could happen. I could just go, well, I'm just going to finish this song and hope that the next one gets them, and that's okay because not it's okay for a set to have peaks and valleys. It's almost essential for a set to have peaks and valleys because otherwise it's just like one monolithic brick of stuff. Um, and or the other option is, okay, well, what can I do with my performance now to to turn the tide? And in almost every case, the better option is to do less rather than more. Maybe literally just take my hands off the instrument and look at the audience and reconnect. Just do something shocking to change the channel right there, because it's like, okay, what's happening right now, and it's probably some flurry of craziness that left the audience behind at the last intersection. It's like doubling down at that point isn't necessarily going to get anybody back as much as changing it up radically will. So I think that would be my, it's you can't say with certainty because every circumstance is different and comes with its own set of parameters and rules. But sitting here right now, my question would be to just like stop playing. Maybe look at Joe Travers and make him do something on the drums that will blow everybody's mind. It's because that's kind of where I go, because my music is so much me that I would think, oh, maybe everybody just needs a little less of me right now. There's time in a show for plenty of me. It doesn't have to be me all the time. So I think that would be in a word, subtract some me at that moment.
Oh my God, buddy, that's I've tried to define why I love you so much to people throughout the past few years, And you may have just summarized it there. There's very few people that are willing to have that as their first course of action. Most people are like, oh, if you don't like this, it just means that, yeah, like you say, you're going to double down. Here's
Right, right,
E
right.
squared, right?
Yeah, I'm
Like,
gonna force this down your throat until you do like it. Well, that's not a very friendly thing to do, you know?
well, yeah, and I guess the assumption is flawed from the beginning too. It's like, no, they clearly can't be that they don't like me. It's just that there's got to be more of me. There's just not enough.
They did your name's on the ticket, so they do like you. They did, pay their money to come see you and what you do.
Yeah.
But especially in statistically dense music, everybody can hit a point of overload, and it's I just think it, and artistically it also makes sense to pull back sometimes, allow those shafts of sunlight in, changes of texture, changes of mood, changes of density. It's really important, and I think that's what makes most people respond to music. When music gets too statistically dense, most people just can't even comprehend it. They just turn off.
It's interesting. I think a lot of the foundation for reasoning behind people wanting to get on stage, not everybody, of course, but a lot of us, is maybe some sort of fundamental lack from the beginning. And so it's trying to fill that void, trying to find a sense of I'm worthy, or I'm capable, or I have the capacity to be around these people whom I uh, value and admire. And in those moments, it's obvious why a lot of people would default to, well, then it just needs more me. If they
Right.
don't like me right now, then it's almost like the panic button gets hit. And
Sure. And
to be,
but yeah, what you need is actually the self-confidence to realize, no, clearly these people like me or they wouldn't be here. I don't need to prove anything to myself or to them. All I need to do, once again, I serve the audience by serving the music. So, if you go into some panicked flurry of notes, that is, I think, almost by definition coming from a place from that's other than how do I best serve this piece of music right now. That's it's literally pushing the panic button, and unless you're in wartime conditions, that's never the right thing to do. Panicking doesn't ever sound like the right answer to a question. Well, what should we do right now? I know, let's panic. But you do have a choice to just stop, even if you're feeling panic. If you just like stop playing for a second, you give yourself the opportunity to allow that panic to subside. And I understand that if you're playing a composed piece of music, you can't, just like stop executing your part. You've got a job to do. But if you're in an improvisational moment, that's the perfect opportunity to stop. It's almost like your duty. Nobody wants to improvise with a guy who never stops playing. That sucks. It's like you need, by definition, you need to allow the other players on stage the room to make their statements, to serve the music in their own way. And that's part of your job as well. That's an important part of playing, is sometimes not playing.
maybe one of the most valuable pieces of advice I think people could possibly hear. Although when we just say it out loud, it's hilarious. It's like, yeah, Mike Keneally says his biggest piece of inspiring advice is just stop playing.
Stop playing. Just stop.
Just stop. Just done. You're good. Just go home, man. Brother,
Well, I mean, but that's a
I
Miles Davis thing too. It's the space between the notes as much as the notes.
I love you so much, man, and I appreciate so much
Appreciate
you taking the
it.
time to do this, and
Of
I
course,
can't
my
wait to see
pleasure.
you again. And all my love, and continue being the beacon of brilliance, the agent of creation that helps people, because you have the self-confidence and the calmness to get out of the way of people. And going back to one of the first things you said, which I think is a great way to summarize what I've heard from you today, is it's when you listen to music, if you love music, if you started with a moment of inspiration somewhere in your life that put into your soul a love of sound, then perhaps one of the greatest things you can do in an improvisational scenario is it's less about thinking what you can contribute to it technique wise and more about what does this need right now.
That's it. That's all of it. It's what sound does this moment require to be all it can be? And sometimes it's a sound that some other guy in the band is going to make, not you, but it could also be something you do. It's a series of moments of assessing that over and over and over again, and it's great fun. It's like a wonderful strategic intuitive game while it's happening, and it's playing. You're playing music.
Brother, I love you. I'll see you
Love you
soon.
too.
Okay. All right.
See ya. Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
The tools that make this podcast possible, provided by Roswell Microphones and X5.